So our next panel is on electrification in India. Is it fiscally sustainable? And it's a very good segue from our last panel, where we heard how much sort of India's electricity sector has been a big part of the debt problems that the states in particular have been facing. I think we all sort of recognize that no sector apart from agriculture has had as rocky a road in sort of reforms. And for over half a century, there have been countless government reports, an alphabet soup of central government reform programs, huge number of sort of funds and programs from MDBs. All of these have had very, very little impact. So this morning's panel, we sort of heard how much, or we have a sense, but not exact numbers on the electricity sector and sort of debt. And now we have a very nice paper from Prabhat Barnwal of sort of Michigan State and Nicholas Ryan, like from Yale. I unfortunately got the slides this morning only, so I don't have much of a sense of the paper, but I'm sure I'll sort of learn like from them. So you want to start?
Thank you, Devesh. So we are going to talk about the power sector, the big elephant in the room that was described in the previous session. We are going to ride that big elephant in this session, hopefully. So electricity has been one of the source of the economic growth as well as the marker of economic development in India. And at the same time, it has also become a cause of this fiscal burden that we are going to discuss today. Neither Nick nor I are macroeconomists, so what we are going to present today is more sort of bridge from the macro issues and eventually going to the micro side of the problem. So I will start with 5 facts which will help us understand this policy problem more clearly. The first fact here is that India has achieved a near universal grid electrification and household electrification in the last decade. This is a remarkable achievement. If you see, like from 1980, when 1 out of 4 households were connected to the grid, we have come a long way. The government of India, claimed under the Saubhagya program that we have achieved 100% of this electrification, and there is no recent census data from 2021 available. So we looked into National Family and Health Survey data that asked the question whether your household has electricity or not. And that also confirms this government claim that yes, we have about 97% of households currently connected to the grid. So this important achievement also comes with an associated observation that a lot of these states that were lagging in electrification as of very recently, like census 2011, we have Bihar, less than 20% electrification. We have Assam and UP, we have Odisha, less than 40%, around 40% electrification. These are the states where this gain is made, and to bring these states up to the national level, and now like Bihar is the one which observed almost 80% gain in electrification. Likewise for Assam, UP, Odisha, and Jharkhand. So overall, what we see there, these states which were lagging for certain reasons, that is now brought up to the near saturation level. One related point here is that these are also the states where people are less likely or have less ability to pay for electricity. So that makes the case that as we are increasing the electrification, probably this is also going to add to the loss discoms have been making for a long time. The third fact here is that this expansion of electrification that we have observed in recent time is not a feat of technological some turnaround or kind of strategize expansion of operations by discoms. It's like the one scenario that discoms has been running the show in a very good and fair way, and they are using their own profit or like borrowing from the market to expand, and that's how we have achieved this universal electrification. But that's not how it has happened. This electrification feat of in India is mainly based on the fiscal capacity of the central government and also the mutual cooperation between the central and the state governments. So here we list all these programs which have been run in last 2 decades to basically expand the grid to the rural India, starting with the Rajiv Gandhi Gramin program. And then RPDRP and IPDS Saubhagya has been phenomenal. And together, these programs have Government of India with all these programs. Government of India has invested a lot in the infrastructure for the discoms to expand the grid and to connect households to the grid. So while discoms have been making a lot of losses, this expansion of grid also increased the subsidy reliance, the reliance of the state subsidy of these discoms. So as we see in this graph, all these states which observe more of these gains, except a few which are on the x-axis, they are more likely to now rely on this subsidy from the state, because as I mentioned earlier, that in most of these cases, expansion of grid doesn't mean that all the new customers are going to pay the bill. So apart from the direct support that the Government of India provided over time, that is in expanding the infrastructure, there has also been this cyclic bailouts provided to discoms. So we talked about, we discussed this bailout, we saw the discussion in the last session, and they create the moral hazard for discoms in this case. So the clear story here is that in 2001-2002, the first major bailout in recent time, called one-time settlement scheme, was announced. And the idea was that it will basically achieve 2 goals. One is that it will restore the financial condition of discoms to a healthy level. And also, at the same time, it will basically invest in a more forward-looking way that discoms will not incur these kind of losses over time again. However, this was not really effective overall, as we see that in 2012, 2015, and again in 2020, the Government of India had to bring in more of these bailouts to support discoms. And as things are going, we are very positive that in the future also more of these bailouts are going to come. Overall, these bailouts, in rupees terms, have cost around 3.57 lakh crore. And the typical cycle here is that discoms run large losses. They don't have their financial situation in order. And in the end, the Government of India to not force discoms to basically put the light off, and also because of the resulting any implication for the banking sector, proposes this bailout and takes on their debt and losses indirect way, either directly by grants or by asking banking sector to take over these loans, these debts, and provide loans to discoms to restore their financial health. Once that is done, then over time the discoms restart making these losses, and the time comes again for another bailout. So this goes on as we have been seeing. So to summarize briefly, universal electrification in India has been achieved by sheer fiscal capacity of the Government of India, and at the same time, Government of India has been urging these discoms to improve their operations. Discoms have been traditionally running this loss-making venture, which is the foundation this electrification is standing on currently. And these one-time debt relief or bailout packages are actually doing little to turn around the situation in discom, and we are going to discuss more of that later in this session. And the question which it brings us to, that whether in this way, if we keep going, can states sustain the electrification and power supply through the continuing subsidies without any effective, meaningful operational improvements shown by discoms, or overall is the electrification is at risk in India? So that is the main question we are going to discuss today. So there are 3 sections. First, I'm going to describe the fiscal condition of Indian power distribution companies, and then Nick, my co-author, will take over, going more deeper into that fiscal condition, especially on the subsidy aspect of it. And in the end, we are going to propose, discuss a policy reform which can help basically take the incentives from this system away, which are causing this kind of financial problem. So first, simple breakdown of all the income these discoms receive. They get money from bill-paying consumers that we call operational revenue. They also get money from state governments. State governments subsidize power for agriculture consumers as well as households. Mainly for agriculture consumers, power is often free or charged at a very low price level. And the third category is the funds discoms get from Government of India. One part of that is explicit, like investment in expanding grid and providing connections to households, and that is what I discussed earlier. Starting from Rajiv Gandhi program to Saubhagya, the Government of India has made a lot of investment there. And the second part is more implicit. These are the bailouts where the state debt restructuring and subsequent backing of debt takes place. So one important program of this sort is UDAY. Under UDAY, which was launched in 2015, states are required to take over 75% of the debt discoms had standing in 2015. That is about 3 lakh crore. So about a little over 2 lakh crores is required by states to be taken over, and states are going to fund that by issuing bonds. So one key element of that is that all the losses which were earlier on discoms books and not showing up on states accounts are going to be transferred to states account under this recent bailout called UDAY. So we are going to show you some impact analysis of how that impact how this bailout program UDAY UDAY actually performed. So showing revenue breakdown of discoms, despite all these bailouts over this last 12-year period, there is very little change in how much of this revenue is coming from bill-paying consumers. So in 2009-10, about 75% of the revenue was coming from these bill-paying consumers, and that has actually come down to about 71% in 2021-22. This outlook becomes very different once we start adding up other things. So what are those other things here? So first is regulatory income and other revenue and grants. Some of them exist only in theory and they are not going to be realized. Discoms get some sort of concession on this income on books for future tariff revisions, but they may or may not realize, as we have seen in the past. The other substantial part is when we include state subsidy on the top of this. State subsidies basically change this discom performance. If you look at the gap from the normalized expenditure, the gap is diminishing over time once we add these state subsidies, and it has come down almost. The gap is almost bridged in the most recent year. But that's also the year when state provided, in fact, more subsidy to discoms than they were billed by discom. And a part of that is partly driven by this UDAY bailout program conditions, which has asked states to take over the losses from discoms in gradual manner. And further, there are additional grants under UDAY bailout program, and that together basically present this picture that discoms have been performing better over time. But if you only look at the operational income, there has not been any improvement. It has been very stagnant. Further, we look into a case study of Rajasthan. Rajasthan is a special case. It is, if you look at the operational income, it is showing big improvement since 2015-16, from 47% to 62% of the total revenue is coming from bill-paying consumers. However, if you compare from the base of 2009-10, this is we saw a lot of improvement right before 2015-16, and there was a big drop in 15-16 in the year when UDAY was announced. That partly indicates some sort of moral hazard here. When a big bailout is about to come, then state discoms basically clean the book in some way and then show the progress over time. Whatever little progress Rajasthan has made over time, that was that is shown on the operational revenue side here. However, if you again like keep adding these additional terms like regulatory income and other revenue and grants, and specifically the state subsidy, you see a regular improvement, continuous improvement in Rajasthan discoms performance. Once you add the Uday grants, they actually almost appear to be running in profit. In fact, the state government claimed in 2017-18, then our discom is now in profit. And this is as obvious here, that in 2017-18, the operational income was just little over half of all the power the state government was selling. And this profit was coming mainly because of the bailout grants and other subsidies the state government received. In fact, that year, because UDAY required states to take over this debt from discoms books to states' own books, the state deficit without UDAY financial burden was less than 2,000 crore. Once you add UDAY financial burden, it went up to 14,000 crore in Rajasthan. So that shows that there's some sort of transfer has taken place about these kind of existing debt from discoms to state books, and at least in some way this provides incentives to states to impose some sort of fiscal discipline on discoms, which was not there earlier because these kind of losses were not showing up on state books. So further we look into UDAY bailout package more closely. We have about 18 states which issued UDAY bonds. In total, they covered about 200,000 to 197,000 crore by financial year 21-22. And discoms in these states also received grants about 72,000 crores. There are some other states who signed the MOU with the central government under UDAY, but they did not issue any UDAY bonds. So we because these states did not join UDAY all at the same time, there was some staggered joining here. Some states joined in 2016, some joined in 2017. So we use an event study analysis framework here to compare this relative trend in operational performance of discoms after this event, that is joining UDAY and issuing UDAY bonds. So the first thing is that we see it is important to note that there were two main goals of UDAY bailout. One was to bring the ATC, this technical and commercial losses, down to 15% by 2017-18. And the second was to reduce the gap between cost of supply and cost and the revenue, average cost of supply and average revenue, to zero. None of these two goals were met. In 2017-18, discoms were running ATC losses of about 23%. The states that issued UDAY bonds had ATC losses of about 25%. And as you can see here, the gap between cost of supply and revenue rate was far from zero. Only in the recent year, it has got down towards zero. And Nick is going to show a little bit more on that, that how subsidies are affecting it. But when we look at Uday's impact, there is not much impact, as there's literally on this gap. The states which issued UDAY bonds did not perform much better than states that did not issue UDAY bonds. So in principle, UDAY provided this kind of conceptual incentive and theoretical incentives to states, because now states are taking over the debt and losses from discoms book to their own books. they should be imposing some sort of fiscal discipline into discoms, but it has not led to any meaningful gains. When we look at ATC losses, again, it's mostly flat. If anything, ATC losses in UDAY bond states are slightly higher than other states that did not issue UDAY bonds. One important point here is that what basically how the ATC losses are defined. ATC losses in India are basically a kind of a black box. If we compare with OECD countries, in OECD countries, ATC losses run at the rate of around 6%. That includes transmission as well as distribution losses. There's going to be some losses because of how the electricity travels in cables that you cannot avoid. But in OECD countries, that loss is about 6%. In India, the transmission loss itself is more than that, about 6.5%. And once we combined all kind of commercial losses, that includes thefts and non-payments together, we see like losses of in the order of 20 to 30%. And that has been consistent. There have been some changes in recent years, but overall the losses has been running very high, and that is the kind of a core reason why discoms are running such large losses. Now Nick will take over.
So my job is to make you a little more discouraged than Prabhat already has, and then try to pull us back from the abyss. So the discouragement is that the fiscal condition of the discoms, once you take out this subsidy dependence, is even worse than sort of depicted there. So the basic relationship of the discom to the customer without the government is what is called a commercial orientation. They're selling a product, which is electricity, and they're getting some revenue from the customer. We have drawn the revenue arrow to be a bit skinnier than the power supply arrow, which is about the relation that they have in reality. But in this sector, that commercial orientation basically does not exist, because after the discom collects some amount on power, it can then book a subsidy to the state government for the units it has supplied to subsidize categories of consumers, including categories of consumers, as in agriculture, that don't necessarily have a metered power supply at all. Therefore, the subsidy received from the government is basically dependent on the report of the distribution company and not necessarily on what they have supplied. If they reduce the supply of power, for example, because they're losing AT&C loss, as Prabhat said, this is power that's not being billed or not reaching to customers and being metered, then it doesn't necessarily reduce the flow of subsidies. And this is the cause of the sort of moral hazard and inefficiency problem. Just to encapsulate this, on the left, I've put the AT&C loss trends with the subsidies included. Why do the subsidies matter for losses? Because they're counted as revenue. So if I book as subsidized power supply, some supply that's going to agriculture, that doesn't enter into my loss. So the larger the discoms book, the smaller the loss appears. In the right-hand side, we plot the same thing, but where we've gone back into the raw numbers and taken out the agricultural subsidy. So on this standard, the losses are up at, say, 40% of supply instead of 16.4 in the most recent fiscal year. So these losses remain very large, and that line is nearly flat once you take out the subsidy over time. So I'm not going to go into this, but basically what this means is if the losses are flat and the number of customers are getting larger, the total subsidy bill is going up. So it's now something like 170,000 crores per annum across all of these states put together. So what does this leave us? The good is that there's been a huge achievement in universal electrification, and the subsidy transfers have now been brought onto the state's books. So rather than being these sort of hidden or contingent liabilities, they're more explicit liabilities. The bad is that those liabilities remain enormous, and progress in operational efficiency has been very slow. So I'm now going to offer one idea, instead of a sort of menu of policy reforms, just one big idea to try to fix this problem. And that's direct benefit transfers for electricity. And I'll describe how these would work and how these would possibly sort of correct this incentive problem. So as I described before, the ideal would be a commercial orientation, but if you can't have that, the next best is to have the subsidy flow going from the state government directly to customers. So the arrow is going around the distribution company. The distribution company therefore does not make a report to the state government of the subsidies they would like to book. Rather, they bill their customers and receive revenue from their customers. The customers then get the subsidy support from the government. So this imparts a commercial orientation even though the customer remains subsidized. And under this model, if you reduce supply to customers, you also reduce your revenue because they're not paying you as much and you don't get to get this indirect flow of subsidy. Now, this, I think, 10 years ago was not feasible. At the time of the one-time settlement scheme in 2001, it certainly was not feasible. But today, it's easily feasible because there have been huge advances, firstly in authentication and transfers, and secondly in public acceptance and acknowledgement of DBT as a mode of subsidy delivery. So I put up here the LPG and the PM Kisan scheme subsidy transfers, which are huge and very successful programs built on this backbone. Now against those, electricity would be much larger. So for many farmers in agriculturally intensive states, like in Punjab or Rajasthan, PM Kisan is 6,000 rupees in 3 installments of 2,000 over the course of a year. The agricultural electricity subsidy could be 3, 4, or 5 times that, depending on the size of your pump and the intensity of usage in the status quo. So this is a huge potential subsidy transfer, and it's not a new budget line item. It's not a new expenditure. It's a repackaging of this existing and inefficient sort of wastage and encouragement of overconsumption. So that's the potential. And then specific to electricity, there have been several advancements that make this DBT newly feasible. One is that the government is already committed in this 3 lakh crore revamped distribution sector scheme to fund electricity meters for every customer in the country, domestic, agriculture, and the like. And the second is the formalization of subsidies that Prabhat described. Now that the subsidies have been brought onto the state books, it makes it much easier to change the mode of subsidy delivery. And this is sort of a working example just to show the incentive effects of this kind of scheme. Here I've put on the gray line the example of a tariff for a domestic category of consumer. So imagine on the first 200 units, you get a discount. So the slope over here is lower. It's going up at only 2 rupees per unit. And then after 200 units, you pay the full price. It's going up now at 6 rupees per unit. So the blue line is the cost of supply, and the gray line is what you actually pay. So under a DBTE, you take that gray line and you can twist it. So just make it into this sort of orange line, which critically goes down into the negative territory as well. So what that means is if the consumer uses less than about 120 units, they would actually get paid. The advantage of this is it makes a strong sort of marginal incentive to conserve at every point in the distribution. So regardless of what you use, you have an incentive to use less, so you can either reduce your bill or you can pocket an additional rebate. You can do the same in the agriculture sector. The difference in the agriculture sector is that the highest point would be at 0. So all of it is potentially in the negative. So what are the objections? If I've sort of argued that this is feasible, I think there are 2 objections that still stand. One is that farmers would never accept it. It's not politically feasible, even if technically it's an easy thing to do. And the second is, well, maybe it's not needed because there have been various reforms to restrict supply to agriculture, so perhaps those have already solved the problem. I don't think either of those is true. I don't think either argument holds water. I'm going to very briefly describe 2 pilots that I've worked on with my co-author Anant Sudarshan in Rajasthan and Punjab of this idea of DBT for electricity and how those have fared and how this bear on the sort of criticisms that are offered here. So the scheme in Rajasthan was run by JVVNL, in Punjab by PSPCL, but supported by the state governments in both cases. So these are small pilots in Rajasthan for several hundred farmers, in Punjab for several thousand, but they've run for several years, and they implement essentially the design that I described. That is, paying consumers for reductions below an already low or even zero rate for electricity in the status quo. So in the status quo in Rajasthan, the power is billed only at less than 1 rupee per kilowatt hour. In Punjab, there are no bills and even no meters. So to enroll in this program, you have to additionally get a meter to start. After sort of introducing this is just a simple result of a poll in both states. Would you recommend the DBT for electricity to other farmers? And basically 90% of people in both states, and these are states with very strong sort of agricultural unions and lobbies, which were purportedly very much opposed to any agricultural reform, but over 90% said yes, they would recommend it to others. Now, the second question is this necessary? If power supply is being rationed, maybe farmers are sort of already using the appropriate amount. And you hear this from government officials occasionally. How do you determine the ration of power? Well, we're meeting the farmer's requirement. But the farmers don't have only one requirement. There's a different requirement for every person. And so this is why we use a price mechanism instead of a rationing mechanism in general to allocate power supply. So what we did in the pilot is look at the consumption of the farmers that enrolled, compare those to those who didn't, and if we saw that there was no change, then we would say, okay, the incentive doesn't matter, the rationing is doing a good enough job on its own. Instead, what we see is before enrollment, the consumption is essentially the same. There are seasonal fluctuations. Now, again, the monthly consumption, this is in Rajasthan. I just want to put units on this. This is like 1,000 units a month or 1,200 a month. So that's 6,000 rupees a month as far as the cost of supply of power. That's a large amount per farmer. After the program is introduced, about a quarter of farmers took it up very, very quickly. And their consumption, which is the solid blue line, went down sharply, like 30 to 40% relative to the consumption of farmers that did not enroll. So this is the evidence that there are still large efficiency gains from providing marginal incentives, even in an environment where power supply is limited by sort of rationing, switching off of agricultural supply. So just to wrap up and connect this back to where Prabhat started, there's been massive progress, universal grid electrification in India in the last 5 years. But this has not been achieved through improvements in state discom finances or operational efficiency. So this leaves a large formalization of subsidies, which in the present form is a fiscal risk, but could also be an opportunity to convert that massive pre-existing expenditure into a direct benefit transfer and improve the efficiency of power consumption in the sector. So thank you very much. I look forward to the comments of our discussants.
So we have two knowledgeable discussants, Kavita Rao of FNI PFP and Lavish Bhandari of CSEP. Kavita?
Yeah. Should I go there? Yeah. Can I close this? Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a very interesting paper to read. It raises obviously very pertinent questions, given that we've spent the morning talking about the criticality of power sector and reforms in the power sector, not just for the sector, but for the fisc of states and by inference the fisc of the country. So I think the long-term trends are very interesting to understand because of one statement, one summary statement. Most of the reforms haven't worked. So time to think back, time to redesign, time to evaluate. I was looking at the changes that are now being reported as success stories as of 21-22, And as the paper notes, there is a reduction in AT&C losses from 22% on average to 16%. There is an improvement in the gap, variously defined. There's also a better response from states on subsidy payments. The paper goes on to argue that accounting practices of discoms are not transparent and therefore do not allow for effective analysis of sources of losses or the true dimension of losses the discoms face. The paper then focuses on better mechanisms for delivery of services and proposes briefly a mechanism for direct benefit transfer. My apologies if there's a later version of the paper. I read one version and I'm basing it off that. One important question to ask before I talk about anything else is, do we view states as being distinct entities from discoms? If they are pretty much two departments of the same entity, then Uday couldn't have brought about changes in performance. That having been said, there are three brief comments I have on the paper. The first is more by way of information and seeking your response to it. In the last 1 year, there seem to be a few other changes that are emerging from the union government side, which attempt to restrict and hence bring more discipline in discom performance. The first one is the implementation of the late surcharge rule, which has, according to the website called prapti.in, it has reduced the dues of the discoms to 70,000 crore, which is a substantial reduction, and overdue amounts are only 26,000 crores. So there is a restructuring happening and there is a push to get more payments on time, and in the short term it looks like a promising intervention, but I'd like to know how people will visualize it. The second element is the annual review and release of higher borrowing limits under RDSS. For the current fiscal year, the limits have announced is about 1.43 lakh crores. The question to ask ourselves is, does the union government have the wherewithal to monitor and therefore bring better discipline by the way of allocating of these high borrowing limits? So those are the two information points I'd like some response to. The second issue is a slightly more general issue, and that is while we are looking at averages and the averages do tell a story, there is substantial difference in performance across states. If you look at special category states, for instance, they are uniformly poorly performing. They can have, if you look at the costs per kilowatt hour, for instance, Chandigarh has the lowest rate of about 4.63 rupees per kilowatt hour, whereas Mizoram goes up as high as 10 rupees per kilowatt hour. So the range is pretty large. Even if you knock off the real outliers, the range is between 5 to 8 per kilowatt hour. The question I'm trying to ask is, are the costs of power different across states, and therefore are there handicaps that different discoms face, fiscal or otherwise, and would that need to be incorporated into a reform program? It is quite clear that states which depend heavily on hydel power, for instance, get cheaper power than if you were depending on thermal power. And so the question that I'm trying to ask is, do we have to unbundle the 28 states of India into 3 blocks to analyze, or is it fair to lump them all together when we are talking about performances, also when we are talking about reforms going forward? The third comment is about the proposed DBT, a very interesting idea. It appeals to all the economists in us. It is a predetermined amount fixes the subsidy being made available, It provides incentives to optimize consumption of electricity. The 15th Finance Commission too had proposed the DBT in power to bring in more discipline for state finances. The presentation I felt was a little confusing about the arguments for considering DBT. It asks the question, who does the distribution companies serve? While articulating the position, we are asking ourselves, do the consumers have a choice? And if the consumer doesn't have a choice, what exactly does the direct subsidy do? For the state finances, it potentially can reduce the liability of subsidy, but the graphs that you presented, it shifts what is being called subsidy now to operating revenues. And the efficiency part I get, but the subsidy part is where it is. So to the limited extent that the government pays both of these, shouldn't the subsidy being paid by the state governments be considered revenue as well? So the idea that DBT should be unconditional and refundable is interesting. It goes very close to being an income transfer, and how you tie it to sectors and keep it limited is one question. And the final element in that story is in India, I think we are more comfortable with transfers which are pegged in rupees in nominal terms. Making an entitlement fixed in terms of units of electricity might be a challenge. So we might start running down the amount of subsidy available by fixing it in nominal terms. I'll stop with that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Devesh. Thank you, NCAER. Thanks, Poonam, for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure. I must say I got the paper earlier than you did. So I have gone over it, at least the version that was shared earlier. It's a very well-written paper. I really enjoyed it, and it's not something in this space, especially with the major complexities. It's not an easy paper to write. I mean, given this sector, and so I must at the onset appreciate that. I also want to just frame a larger question, and I'm not going to talk about it, but I think that's one really important part of such a discussion, which is what is there in a larger political economic structure that we always presume that the state governments are not really interested in doing the right thing, or at least they are less interested in doing the right thing than the central government. I mean, that presumption seems to pervade everything that we as economists seem to talk about. Anyway, so the paper, essentially, I'll just review it very briefly for in a couple of minutes. Essentially, the way I understand the paper, there are problems related to metering, monitoring, billing, collections, technologies. As a consequence, we are unable to collect enough revenues which are comparable to the expenditures. And as a result, the government has to resort to supports, of subsidies, of bailouts, and of course bank credit. So these are the broad methods by which doing it, and this is not sustainable. The solution that you propose is that some sort of a direct benefit transfer is provided, and later this is given first, and later the billing reflects some of this. And of course, this is all dependent on the quality of metering, and so therefore that is essentially the necessary condition for this to work. I really liked one part of this, which I don't think you go deeper into it. It was this perverse result that Uday designed to benefit the system may have led to perverse outcomes, right? To me, that reflects, and I'll talk about this a bit later, is that means that there is something in the current mechanism that is working right. Right. That is why when you introduce some flexibility, then that doesn't. So I think there is something here that you may want to see, that by putting in more funds, you are creating a worse outcome. That means there is something there which is working. That's something for you to just think about. So, but this is the first part of it. My problem here is with your overall solution. There are many layers, and I feel that at least some layers you would do well to look into. Having said that, I think as microeconomists, and you started with that, I think only microeconomists can look into this problem, and so I think you're the right people to look into this. There is a state regulator. A really important component here is the state regulator, and that's what one of my colleagues' work, Rahul, has talked about in his work. And the way the state regulation works is conceptually you have cost plus pricing. You spend first, you share that with the regulator later, and the regulator then helps you update your pricing mechanism. And so therefore things over a period of time should equate. The fact that it does not over a period of time essentially says that there is something in this whole regulatory process that is not working right. Now, is it the fact that these are all discoms, or most of these discoms are public sector owned, that's the cause of this? And the answer is perhaps not, because we know that even the same problem is faced in states where you have private sector discoms. So that tells you something else, that there is this the state level regulator is something that you need to look into a bit more carefully. Why is this mechanism not really working very well? Now, I would like to just out here mention that, but if you just focused on that, I am guessing even that does not solve the problem. Because of course, the state level regulator is to some extent more susceptible to pressures coming in from the state government. I think there is a large literature on regulatory takeovers. I don't think there is as large a literature on public sector regulator takeovers, but it would be really nice to better understand what is it that's helping align the state government's incentives with those of the regulator. I think it would be nice for the paper to look into some of these aspects, or perhaps a later version of this, or some other paper on this. Having said that, the point that you made about direct benefit, I think it instigated one thought, which I would like you to also think of. I mean, imagine a world where there is a upstream firm, which is a monopolist, and a set of downstream firms. The upstream firm is owned by government 1. The downstream firms are owned by government 2, right? But the upstream firm is a monopolist. In such a situation, you have the solution, or whatever the outcome that you would see would be that the upstream firm is very profitable, and the downstream firm is not so, because it's being, obviously, I mean, the upstream firm is the one that, being a monopolist, can charge all the rents, right? Now, if you look at the Indian public sector, the bulk of the profits, or I should say, at least the Indian energy firms are the ones, or the public sector energy firms are very profitable entities. They're all upstream, whether you have Coal India, NTPCs, etc. Right? They are the profitable ones.
Yeah.
And they're all central government.
And they're all central. So this is government 1, right? But the downstream firms are the ones that are the loss-making ones. So essentially, you could also think of this problem as a market structure problem. In such a situation, your solution doesn't work. Because then, if government 1 was to give a direct benefit transfer, government 2 would retaliate by actually, despite that, still giving more of a subsidy. So you want to look into some of these aspects as well. With that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thanks, Lavish. Just to add a few comments before we open it up. One of the things, like from your presentation, when you said, I wasn't sure about the title of your paper, which it says, is it fiscally sustainable? You know, I've been reading these reports for the past 50 years. You can look at government reports on the electricity sector. So clearly it's been sustainable for half a century. Why not for another half century?
It's sustainable in a very poor state.
No,
I mean, I don't think one
true. But the whole thing is sustainability doesn't imply poor or good. And for an ancient civilization like ours, what's 50 years, what's 100 years? So you could ask, The second is, usually, and this is to pick up on your point about the villain is usually the state government in this whole story, right? But I think we should look at the role of the center, and since Montek is here, I'm going to ask him to speak to this. So one is, if you look at all the electricity reform efforts, broadly it's been that the center has had a large carrot and a small stick, right? And a lot of central entities like the Power Finance Corporation, etc., overdrafts at the RBI, the center has essentially fed this beast for all these years. If the center had instead starved this beast, could this ever have continued, right? Then bankruptcy would have rolled, would have happened. And when bankruptcy happens, things have to change. So in other words, and this is also sort of related to the point on the very limited success of the sort of Uday program, because you're basically feeding the beast. And the states are very savvy on how to, budgets are fungible, etc., etc. So is the idea that one can do reforms by the center actually giving no money, by being much more strict and let the states be on their own? I mean, they want more autonomy in any case, and the center just stops. So I wanted to think about that a bit. The third, which was mentioned, but I think one needs to think more, is look, we know that for long, the travails of the electricity sector are absolutely interlinked with agriculture, because that's where the majority of people who vote in India are from. So this is a democracy that is responding to voters, and the voters want something that is clearly suboptimal in a larger sense. But hey, deal with it. It's a democracy. You want the democracy, you get the other side. Look at the United States. There you get Trump, here we get these electricity. So fine. And the last point, which is sort of related to the state regulator, I think there, Lavish, the key issue is the selection process of who becomes a regulator. And what you see is, actually I've seen some stuff, is that it's usually retired IAS officers or state bureaucrats. And they are very much aligned with the interest because they have been really socialized in that system on what the state wants. In fact, that's precisely why they are selected into that. And I think that's why the regulator has been so ineffective in that sense. So I'll stop there, and I know that many of you have been working on this, and we'll open it up. Questions like from the floor. Start with you.
So there's two questions, comments. Picking up from your Devish's last comment, if the explanation for this state is that the regulator being appointed is coming from the bureaucracy and is socialized in a certain way, that argument should also apply to the center. But I think regulators at the center do work a lot better than they have worked at the state level. So there is something different. But my bigger question is, some years ago, to solve this problem, a lot of us were talking about privatization of the distribution companies. I think that seems to have gone completely into the background now. And we are saying that, well, subsidy is really an accepted fact of life, and therefore, how do I do it better? So it's, in terms of the political economy of it, you've obviously narrowed it down to something, narrowed down the instruments to quite a bit. I mean, you're leaving out the possibility that was at least at one point being discussed very actively. And it seems to me that in the end, question one has to ask is, do I want to make the distribution companies competitive, profitable, or not? if I'm going to run them continuous, for eternity as these public sector entities, then I think, you're doing suboptimal exercise, really. The argument you're making about DBT, etc., of course, applies to everything, meaning, fertilizer, it's the same point. It'll apply there. But my suspicion is that the political economy that you missed out is the fact that then it becomes very explicit that all these subsidies are going to very, very large farmers predominantly. The small guys are not going to get very much on this. It is the large guys, both fertilizer as well as electricity. And that comes out in the open once you make it into DBT. Probably it's not going to look very good on the politician. So it's much better to just that, it's a subsidy on what you purchase. And it remains hidden that way.
Govin?
Thank you. Well, I mean, that survey result that you mentioned, that people prefer direct cash transfer, is quite encouraging. But I'm not too sure when you go into a larger issue that works out. In fact, on Punjab we did some work with the Montec chairing a committee report, which is very. I mean, in fact, there was also attempt at crop diversification and various other things. But my question is, I don't know how this can be taken into account. There are two other sources of distortions which create a lot of macro problems. One is cross-subsidization. You can talk about the direct subsidy, but there is a lot of cross-subsidization that takes place, as a result of which is much of the burden is borne by the large industry, because they cannot depend upon the distribution utilities. They have to have captive power generation, and that's much more expensive. And then, of course, with using diesel and various other aspects, that's one part of it, which is not really considered, which should be. I mean, it's not just the power sector, getting the power utility is right, but then there's an economy that needs to be taken care of. The second thing is, I mean, related to this, in order to show that their performance is better, they don't provide adequately for, sort of depreciation, replacement and maintenance of assets. The result is huge outage of electricity, and that outage has gone on forever. And of course, that is the consequence of that is this. And the economic impact of that in terms of cost of power to manufacturing sector, because manufacturing sector is ultimately the one which bears the burden. Thank you.
Do you want to answer this one or take more?
Yeah, I mean, so firstly, thank you to Kavita and to Devesh and to Lavish and to the audience for the comments till now. I'm not going to be able to, we're not going to be able to respond to each of these points, but I just want to take a few of the broadest themes and sort of give a direction. I think the first one, the one I would really like to sort of stop is this, it's a political thing, it's been going on for so long, yes, it's a little inefficient, but what kind of transfer program isn't? I think the way to think about it is, yes, the sector has been stuck in this way for 20, 30 years, and there was a time when free power to agriculture was getting started, when that was almost a reasonable trade-off to make. That if I want to deliver, 100 rupees in benefits to a given farmer via the electrical grid, that might be the most efficient way to do so, even acknowledging that only, say, 60 rupees or 50 rupees of that is going to reach them in any form of tangible benefit, because there will be theft and diversion and inefficiency and overuse of water along the way. But I think the basic point we're trying to make is that time is sort of over, because now it's possible to reach them with the full 100 or something close to it. And to the point that Kavita raised of, well, does it matter if the subsidy reaches to them or if it goes to the distribution company? I think it does matter, because when it goes to the distribution company, they're actually responsible for a lot of the reporting. So it's not that the same amount of subsidized consumption would be registered in either regime. It's very likely that if the subsidies were delivered only directly to the customers for their metered consumption, that amount of subsidy and the amount of losses that we showed you would come down dramatically. So like there would be hundreds of thousands of crores per annum of efficiency gains, as well as gains, to your point about heterogeneity across states, from reduced power purchase costs from discoms that were now newly incentivized to try to economize on their input costs. So I think there are very large gains both on the sort of input side and on the management of the distribution network that would come from routing the subsidies via the customer instead of just via the discom.
Monte?
Thanks, Devesh. Can I be heard?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first, let me say, really enjoyed your presentation, and I have now acquired the paper, so I'll be able to look at it very carefully. And I do recommend everyone to read it because it's really good. Just a question, by the way, which you would say yes or no. Is this is the experiment the one that JPAL were doing? Oh,
Yeah,
that's
so-
a different thing.
So both of these are run through JPAL,
JPAL, okay, fine.
both Rajasthan and Punjab. Yeah.
Okay. Now, I don't want to make comments, but I want to put forward, endorse 4 or 5 propositions on which people have made comments at different points. First, to my mind, it's absolutely essential that all the subsidies we give should be converted into a direct benefit transfer. I mean, in principle, that can be done for fertilizer, though, of course, as Arvind pointed out, it will reveal the fact that you're not actually benefiting the 60% of the population that live in rural areas. It should certainly be done for power for farmers, because exactly the same consideration applies there. And quite frankly, it needs to be done for food. I mean, it's completely absurd at a time when we are stretching our arms towards perfection, as Tagore would have said, becoming a developed country at some time in the mid-century, that we seem to have a fixed structural thing that 66% of the population will be dispensed food grains. So, the principle, I don't know how economists translate that into politics. That's another point that Devesh raised. But it cannot be otherwise than, if you want to give subsidies, do it directly. This has the huge advantage that you would automatically get rid of the idea that 100% of the population has to be subsidized. I mean, after all, if 66% need to have transfers via the food subsidy, surely the electricity benefit can be limited to those who are eligible for the food subsidy. They knock out at least 1/3. And quite frankly, over a 20-year period, if this 66% is reduced to 30, 25, which today nobody can deny, you put in place a system that will automatically eliminate these things. So I think that's very important, and I don't know how you get it done, but I think economists should have it constantly on the agenda so that at least they can ask politicians when elections are not around the corner, do you agree with this view or not? At the moment, there is no record of any politician actually having agreed to any sensible move in this direction because nobody asked the question. That's the first point. Second point, I'm firmly of the view that we should privatize the distribution companies. This will enable the distribution companies, of course, to get very good, not just to get good talent, but also promote it in a manner that is more management oriented. But most importantly, it will put them in a genuine confrontational position vis-a-vis the regulator. As long as the distribution company is a public sector company, it will behave in the way it thinks the interests of the public of the government wants it to behave. And if the government wants low prices, I mean, the simplest way of getting it is to just tell the distribution company to assert all kinds of efficiency benefits that they expect to have, as a result of which they need no tariff increase at all. And there are many cases of distribution companies in otherwise well-managed states not getting a tariff increase for 10 years and not complaining. Now, frankly, if you put in the private state, those fellows would complain they would utilize political instruments to get some sensible thing done. The third thing is really state governments do not feel the need for any political rationalization or expenditure, because basically they have the option of simply not paying wages for an indefinite period, which gives them a huge amount of, central government doesn't do that. So actually the only area where fiscal discipline actually applies is the center, and that is directly connected with the globalization of the economy, because you have lots of sensible people telling any finance minister that if you let the fiscal deficit go out of control, well, the consequence will become very immediate all over the system. We don't have that in state governments at all. And so this points to what Rakesh said, that if you're running a system in which state governments are under no compulsion to do fiscally sensible things, how on earth do you make progress? And I don't have the answer to that. That's why I'm posing it to Devesh. So he can think about it and come up with imaginative solutions. I remember telling, I was responsible for the first of the sequentially failed restructuring schemes. I was actually involved in the first two. When I designed the first, went off to the IMF. By the time I came back, I had to do the second. And then there's been a third and a fourth for which I take no responsibility, though I have great sympathy with the guys who put it forward. Now, really, I did make the point that what on earth is the point of introducing a fiscal incentive to improve your own profitability? I mean, after all, if you care about profitability, you don't need an incentive. That's the biggest thing you could do. But no, we spend a huge amount of time that if you do X and Y and Z, then these chaps will go and improve their profitability. But of course, that's not what they're maximizing. They're maximizing other things. And until you can prevent them from doing that, you really have a problem. Those are just propositions. I'm sorry to take up that much time. I thank you for, since you mentioned me by name, I thought I should be able to say a few things.
There's a question there.
I just wanted, I'm Shubhamoy Bhattacharya. I just wanted to ask just one thing. The Electricity Act reforms was supposed to introduce one element, which was open access. Wouldn't that, if that went through as a regulatory reform, be a far better way of reducing costs all around than even going in for DBT? If the consumer is at the center, which as Kavita was pointing out, then obviously open access clears up much of this mess. There's no competition, because if you get private sector, you'd simply replace a public sector monopoly with a private sector monopoly. That isn't working, obviously, as your paper shows. So therefore, thank you.
Mr. Martin.
I have a completely related question. I obviously haven't read the paper, so I don't know whether it's covered. The basic story I get, this is so familiar. We've been discussing this for God knows when I was already there was electricity sector problems when I was a country economist on India in the 70s. So, but the question I have is this: to look at the future, and the sustainability question seems to me arise in the following context. India is committing itself in some way to net zero. This implies, as any analysis shows, electrification of the economy, which means that electricity supply and usage will have to grow much, much faster than the economy itself. All the other things disappear. That implies obviously a colossal investment program. And what you're telling us is that for each kilowatt hour, the government lose a fortune, essentially. So it does seem to me that if you project forward over 20 years or so, the government is going to lose a colossal fortune. I haven't done the numbers. So the sustainability question of the whole of this electricity system with those commitments seems to me a pretty good question, and I'd love to know what you think about that. If you address it in the paper, I apologize, but it's what I immediately thought of with the headline you're using.
Just to press you on the point made about open access. Instead of all of these other things that are there in the paper, might that not be the way, just force competition? And we know that if you had open access, large consumers like manufacturing large would shift out, because right now they are cross-subsidizing.
So open access is there for large consumers, industrial plants. They can bid in the IEX, the PXI, and many of them do. Some states, because they make more money from the large consumers, discourage the spirit of open access and make it difficult for industries to do that. But it basically cannot apply to these categories of consumers that are heavily subsidized, because an individual farmer who's not even metered, their consumption is essentially now pooled with everybody else in the same electricity feeder. So they could not opt out because we don't even know what they're using necessarily. So open access would require as a precondition, just as it is on the high voltage transmission network, that everybody be reliably metered to distinguish their consumption from that of others. But it has made some progress in keeping down costs and cross subsidies for industrial consumers, and probably lowered the cost of supply for those consumers that were previously the source of a lot of these cross subsidies.
Question about the way the direct benefit transfer scheme operates on the ground. It requires these meters be tamper proof, and the last mile delivery and all this, the enforcement of this scheme is still back to the state electricity company. So how did it work in your two experiments, and was there something you think that could really work nationwide?
Yeah. So that's important. Any system, DBT or otherwise, you need the meters to be enforced to measure consumption against that. And if the discoms have no commercial orientation, then they don't have an incentive to sort of reduce meter tampering. In the schemes that we did, the main rules were essentially if at all your meter is tampered with, then you would be booted out. And in this system where you can get a DBT, that creates an incentive for the customer at least not to tamper with their meter or to report a broken meter in a timely way. And so that at least flips part of the incentive. The traditional incentive is that both the meter reader and the customer are aligned in wanting consumption to be as low as possible. But here, at least in this program, because the customer wants a lower reading and the discom wants a higher reading, then you've kind of corrected that to an extent. You reduce the scope for collusion. But it does require that the discom meter the consumers, as would any attempt to create a marginal price.
You have
No.
anything to add?
No.
Yeah, so to add to the point of open access, I think we have also a similar example from LPG and petroleum sector, where private sector was encouraged earlier to take part in supplying these petroleum products, but it does not take off because the government was subsidizing these products heavily. So as long as the government subsidy is present in this current form, at least, if we have DBT, for example, it can in fact encourage. It could be a complement to like more private sector participation in some ways if the subsidy can be provided to households directly. Few of the points, like I think. Some of these comments have been already answering those questions which are raised here. Few of the points I will touch about the late surcharge rate. If we look into PFC reports, the overall liability to generators on discoms has not been decreasing. What they are showing on Prapti portal is kind of different from what you are seeing in PFC reports, if I'm reading the report correctly. And this is again, like broadly, the lack of transparency is a huge issue in discom sector finances. But Prapti portal itself was at some point it became political, and they took off some data from there. But the bottom line, what we see in PFC reports is the overall liability to generator in number of days as well as 1,000 crores. They have been, I don't remember the number exactly, but those have been increasing over in recent years. One of the points also raised here was that also like what if states are basically providing, what is the problem there? I think the main problem is that, which was discussed the first session this morning, that to some extent like these power sector liabilities become 50-60% of total state liabilities, and this is huge. If it is going to restrict the fiscal space states have to play with, to provide other kind of services, that is going to have like much bigger implications. So that is the reason like there's a need to urgently act on this, and DBT provides one way to do it. I would also add a general point about DBT. I worked on DBT for LPG earlier. Just decoupling the subsidy from the delivery of the product eliminates the incentive for the discoms as well as local staff, meter reader or engineers there, and that has itself has been a big theme of DBT overall. India has shown that for LPG, where the LPG has almost like DBT for LPG has provided secure payments to almost all households who are connected to LPG, except like very much at the households who are like very much at the super bottom of the pyramid. So in terms of scale, it is possible. Households have their linked Aadhaar bank accounts, and then we have achieved the scale. The amount was not as high as it's going to be in case of electricity, as we have seen in the presentation, but this is logically possible. But the main point remains is that it's the incentives we want to take from the system, and that is what DBT is offering.
Okay. So Monty, I'll come back to you with Seema.
If I understood you correctly, there are two advantages of the DBT, or one is the customer on the margin has an incentive to conserve, and then also you have accurate reporting rather than some self-report. But it seems like if you had smart meters, presumably there is some technology where you could have that data could be aggregated and received by the regulator, and so you remove the discretion to say this is my subsidy. So I guess I'm curious whether you have some sense of how much of the benefits could you get just by getting the accurate reporting versus the on-margin incentives.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's my long years of working in the health sector that I worry about technical solutions. I think this is fundamentally a political economy issue. If things were so simple, I don't agree that politicians are silly. There are clearly vested interests in these sorts of things, and there must be winners and losers. I think if you want really a solid sort of recommendation that you want to provide, you also want to look very carefully at who the stakeholders are, who the winners are going to be, who the losers are going to be, and what the political cost is. Okay. In the morning, just one final thing, Ramesh. In the morning, we heard about Punjab being a big deficit state and Gujarat being not a big deficit state. I would argue the reason Punjab is possibly getting away with being a big deficit state is because it's also a very politically contested state. So if you look very carefully, and I didn't have the data from Poonam this morning, but I suspect if you look around carefully, you will find that the most politically contested states are also the ones that are running the biggest deficits, and they have no reason to fight those deficits.
So Montek, you wanted to add?
Yeah, just a little addition to what Martin said about, if we're going to get to net zero, then we've got to fix the distribution system. This is a point that in the work we've been doing at CSAP, we've been emphasizing. And it's interesting that, a lot of the offtake of the renewable power that we are now seeing is because of the intervention or the injection of the Solar Electricity Corporation of India, which actually buys power from the new guys and then sells it to the distribution. But this is actually, I regard as an innovative step by the government, because initially, to leave private sector guys selling PPAs to the distribution companies would not have been a sensible thing. But already SECI is finding it difficult to find buyers for all the sort of PPAs that it's signing up. Now, the expansion of renewable energy consistent with achieving net zero, if that's all to be done with the central government intermediating, then in effect the entire distribution mess will be transferred onto the balance sheet of SECI. Now, there's a lot of progress being made on transparency in the central budget, and so sooner or later, somebody will realize that this is a problem. That's why I think it is important to link it to the climate change objective. Of course, the other side of linking it to the climate change objective is that if prices of energy remain highly distorted and subsidized, there is no chance of achieving the energy efficiency we need. And a lot of the moderation of demand for fossil fuels is going to come from improvements in energy efficiency. But you know, if you're going to be selling electricity at a loss, and the central government is going to take up the deficit by entering into power purchase contracts, then the chance, then you can get, you will get more kind of renewable power, but you won't get fiscal stability at the center. My suspicion is that the center would not tolerate that somehow the crunch will therefore come. Exactly how, I mean, maybe the authors can spell out. One additional point, you made a very important point. I think somebody raised the point about open access. You know, it would be good if you were to add in a footnote, since I think your paper will be very widely read because of the centrality of this subject. Isn't it true that regulators are allowing very high charges to be levied before open access is granted? So actually, except for the huge companies, nobody is actually able to take advantage of this open access because regulators do not want to lose their monopoly control. They just levy a very high charge.
I think so Hajay's point ought to be noted. If you recall a book by Navroz Dubaj and colleagues on the reform of the electricity sector, right? And they make that point, having looked at across all the states over quarter century. There have been so many technocratic fixes at what is at the core of political economy, the problem. And I think you might want to think a little more that while you have a very viable technocratic solution, why do we think or we should have faith that it is more likely to succeed than any of the previous technocratic solutions, which clearly have not succeeded?
But I think I would take that jointly with what Seema asked, which is, could you get the benefit with only the meters, say, to improve the accounting at the same time? So many of those past investments by the central government have been just technocratic in nature. They've been investments in infrastructure or measurement, but they've not really changed the incentives of the parties. And I think this potentially could change the incentives of the parties in the sense of making discoms more sort of commercially aligned in supplying power to collect revenue. Now, is that politically viable today in all states? No. Could it be done? Surely. There are states that are moving in that direction. For example, Andhra Pradesh in the sort of YSR free agricultural power scheme has explicitly made the subsidy into bank accounts named for each recipient farmer, and they've embarked on metering for many farmers. And so that's the infrastructure that's needed for exactly this kind of thing. And then to the point on, there's going to be winners and losers in this sort of dismal state. We're locked in a political battle and everyone's got to lose. That's not the case here. And the reason it's not the case is if you're selling me something for 2 that costs you 6, then we have 4 of pie to split. And so if you stop selling me that unit of electricity I don't need, you can send me 4 and I'm better off than I was before, and you're also better off because you don't have to buy it at 6. So there's real efficiency gains from correcting these distorted prices, and that means that there can be winners and winners instead of sort of winners and losers. It's not a zero sum.
So Devesh, the question is to you. I think you're right. Technocratic solutions don't solve a political problem. But do you have a political economy theory of why utility reforms don't happen in India, water and electricity?
They never asked me to write a paper on it, so I can't.
I asked this question because to be fair, you know, when you drew the pictures of the subsidies, despite all the reforms, we in the World Bank have been doing this for the last 20 years. How much loan have we put into the electricity sector, and how we are still below that, that story. And you know, when I was here in 2000, the whole World Bank program was based on electricity reform. I come back in 2015, and the electricity team is telling me, this is what we have to do again. You know, they weren't there in 2000, I happened to be there, and I just said, can you explain to me what will be different? And there was absolutely no explanation of what is to be different. Now, I've been working on water utility reforms. The idea of pricing water is not an issue of willingness to pay, it's a problem of willingness to charge. It's a phenomenal political economy story. So after 20 years of working in India, I've come to the conclusion that you have to take whatever entry point you have to try and put pressure on reform. So this DBT that has arrived in India is an entry point. Will it lead to the type of utility reform? Who knows? But it is an entry point, and I think we have to use that entry point without any doubt. At one point, I believed that it was federalism that was going to save India, because once you create federalism, and the competition will take care of a lot of that. Well, what triggers federalism in India, right? That too is a question. Today, Dr. N.K. Singh talked about the fiscal transfers for property reform, right? Is a band-aid on not getting local governments to work. So I think the technocratic solution that is being provided, to me, is one more political economy entry point. Will they all add up to utility reform? We shall see. Because I certainly, after 20 years, have no clue what creates utility reform in India.
Well, I think, you know, look, when we look at the history of reforms in India, they've been shaped much more when there's a real crisis. And that's why I've increasingly believed that when you have bankruptcy facing, you're much more likely to get reforms than when the center continues to write more checks. And I think the fact is that there's been a soft budget constraint for the states increasingly, and the electricity sector, on and on and on. And if the center absolutely just does not, and just a simple thing, no RBI overdraft facilities to electricity boards, etc., they will have to come to grips. When you don't have cash, you have to deal with it. But when you continue to get cash, you manage to go on. I frankly believe that we need to think that the center has been taking the wrong approach. It's always been one or other form of a soft budget constraint, and it might be time to think about reversing that. I know we had an IPF on exactly this, just like the World Bank has gone back the IPF every decade does a panel on electricity. I'm sure 10 years down the road, we'll again be back with something like this. So I hope you continue and come back. And until then, please join me in thanking them for an excellent paper and our discussion.